All right. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in to Psychedelically Speaking. Um, University of Ottawa and Society for the Advancement of Psychonautic Studies monthly speaker series. We're having a bit of a slow summer to just recover, but this is an event that we're really excited for today. And before we get into Sedina's presentation, I would just say that stay tuned in the next month or two. We're kind of shifting gears right now, and I think have some updates that we're excited about. So as these semesters are starting up in the fall, just stay tuned. But today we're excited to have Sedina Acolatse here with sacred status symbols, spiritual peacocking, and performativity in psychedelic culture. And just some quick background before I give the floor to Sedina. She is a San Francisco-based psychotherapist and a graduate student in the University of Ottawa's Psychedelics and Consciousness Studies program. Her clinical and research interests are committed to challenging the default narratives of the mainstream psychedelic discourse, centering peoples and perspectives that have historically been overlooked. She uses humor as a tool of cultural critique to disarm defenses, democratize knowledge, and bring accessibility to conversations often locked behind the walls of academia. Her graduate research focuses on the documentation and integration of indigenous African cosmologies, rituals, knowledge systems, and plant medicine traditions into the broader psychedelic record. Sedina, thank you so much for joining us today, and I will hand the floor over to you now. Thank you again.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, just really excited to be here to kind of introduce and talk about this idea that's kind of been developing in my mind, and also good to see some familiar faces as we do this. Yeah, so again, I just hope to, with today's presentation, just hope to introduce this idea, and I think this concept that maybe all of us might be familiar with, but can't really put our finger on, and kind of put some guidelines around it, and hopefully maybe have a discussion afterwards a little bit more. Yeah, so maybe we'll get into it. Um,
And I just want to make sure, actually, can everyone see Sedina's screen? Okay, cool.
Perfect. So today's journey, so to speak, is that we'll introduce and define spiritual peacocking, just to kind of put some words to it and define it a little bit more technically. And then kind of talking about some of its components and additional features. So that includes performativity, how that relates to spiritual peacocking. We'll talk a little bit about spiritual capital and designations of authority. And then lastly, what's next, right? Like, what does this all mean? What place does it have within psychedelic culture and the field and the space? So, yeah. So just to get started before we define it, I think, again, a lot of us have maybe seen this concept in action. So I thought this might be a helpful way to maybe frame, and also a comical way, right, to bring humor to maybe a serious topic. To maybe see it in action before we actually talk about it a little bit. So here, let me go ahead and play this video.
Greetings, family.
Hey, how are you?
Oh, just staying balanced. That's what the lava beads are for. Have you ever worked with lava?
Oh, cool.
Yes, the freedom to express your spirituality is cool. No matter how much or how little you decide to show it. Either way, we are all connected to the divine. Love and light. And that was my 417th ayahuasca journey.
Aho! Feather of a hawk, yes. Clarity, insight, guidance,
Wow.
paired with card of Joker, because life's too short to take seriously. Namaste.
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 Nama-
Namaste. I'll see you at the burn. Oh, you're just in time. Ceremony's about to begin.
Ha. Ha.
And after we go to the playa, we'll probably go to Bali to decompress for a bit. Have you been to Bali? You've never been? You've been once, you know what it is. You know how to spell it? Can you spell Bali?
Okay. So now that we're all kind of on the same page a little bit, again, I hope folks found that found some humor in that, right? But also found some resonance, right? Because maybe there are some aspects that you've seen, maybe there are some aspects maybe that even we noticed that we might perform as well, or behave patterns of behavior that we may engage in as well. But to kind of more technically break down what we just saw, this is what I'm defining as spiritual peacocking. If there are any other terms that folks are familiar with, I would love to hear them. But part of how I, came up with this concept is because I couldn't really think of a word to define it with. I know we all know what it is when we see it, but there's not really a specific term. So in that place is spiritual peacocking. And so I've defined it as the exaggerated performative display of spiritual beliefs, experiences, practices, and or identities for the purpose of signaling authenticity, moral authority, or elevated awareness within a social context. Again, we'll break that down more specifically about some of those components, again, just to create some parameters around this term. But again, all things that we maybe have seen or did see in this short video, right? Kind of an exaggeration. There's this performative display, not to be mistaken with performance, which we'll kind of define a little bit more specifically, but also it's really surrounding spiritual beliefs, and specifically within the psychedelic space, that can be very fluid. It could be spiritual beliefs. It could also be psychedelic practices or beliefs around these practices, or thoughts about origins around these practices, right? So it goes pretty deep. Peacocking also includes experiences, right? So as we heard, right? Oh, this was my 10th ayahuasca experience, right? This is my I hiked 2 hours in the Amazon for my ayahuasca experience, or whatever it is, right? All these kind of exaggerated tools and acts and practices and beliefs, and how we display them in social contexts to assign moral authority and also power, right? Social context, essentially. So we'll get into this a little bit more specifically. So a lot of times folks may think, oh, well, aren't you just talking about bypassing, right? Spiritual bypassing, which may be a term that folks are familiar with, right? That's kind of a part of our lexicon, especially within the field. And what I'm proposing is no, that peacocking is in a act of its own, separate from bypassing. There may be some overlap. We'll talk about that in a second, but again, just wanting to frame that they are two distinct kind of experiences and practices. Just to also define them, so spiritual, as we define spiritual peacocking, and then spiritual bypassing, according to John Wellwood, who coined the term in 1984, is the tendency to use spiritual ideas and practices to sidestep or avoid facing unresolved emotional issues, psychological wounds, and unfinished developmental tasks. Some kind of real life experiences or phrases that I think of with spiritual bypassing might be, let go and let God, right? Like, oh, like, I don't know, I'm just, Jesus take the wheel, or, terms like that. Within the psychedelic space, there are also ways that we can bypass that also, again, it's kind of fluids, which also can validate or encourage, a spiritual peacock, which might be things like trust the medicine, that can also be a term or a phrase specifically within the context of the psychedelic space. So lots of overlap, but again, two kind of distinct experiences. Just to kind of drive this home a little bit and talk about some of those distinctions that I've identified. I think certainly there are more, but just in my initial kind of thoughts, with spiritual peacocking, there's kind of an emphasis on external validation. Whereas with spiritual bypassing, it's more internal, right? You yourself are trying to avoid emotional distress, whereas peacocks are wanting others, right, to validate their experience. And there are gains from that that we'll talk about. In spiritual peacocking, there's the use of performativity for status. Again, we'll define that a little bit more specifically to understand that one. There's a focus on appearance. This can show up in a lot of different ways. You certainly get into conversations of appropriation or extraction when we talk about appearance, right? So it may be the adoption of, again, going back to our example, I think he mentioned like hawk feathers, or hats, certain hats, or certain styles of dress, or markings, right? Tattoos, face paints. I mean, various ways that we can focus on appearance and kind of outward projections or signaling. All of that kind of goes into an overall cultivation of a spiritual persona, or even a spiritual character, if you will. And again, its primary goal is for social recognition and social and spiritual capital. Again, things will also specifically define. Again, spiritual bypassing is more intrinsic, right? You are the primary goal, at least, although there can be social components, which is in the shared traits. You're avoiding emotional distress. There's a denial of difficult feelings. There may be some premature forgiveness because we're bypassing negative, experiences. There's certainly emotional suppression, right? It's kind of the dissociation or bypassing or avoidance, of difficulty, and certainly avoidance of confrontation. So if we are already avoiding this difficult experience, we are not confronting, we are not challenging, which also creates some emotional stuckness, right? Some shared traits, even though I mentioned primarily spiritual peacocking has this social component, bypassing has this kind of individual component, they both are strengthened within the social component. So even though in spiritual bypassing, I am bypassing for my personal gain, it can be reinforced by my community, social constructs, people around me, environments, etc. Right? And that directly goes into that positive feedback loop. So the more that you are reinforced in your bypassing, the more that you continue to bypass. And same thing with spiritual peacocking. The more that community assigns or attributes, power or authority or capital to you because you continue to peacock, the more you become a peacock, the more you get power, right? And then it just creates, it has a life of its own. The momentum is already stored within the practice. And you're encouraged to continue with it. So it can be kind of a difficult experience. Both can serve as protection of the self, certainly in the adoption of this persona and this kind of adoption of, or again, appropriation of various tools. There can be a masking of the self that happens, again, even though it is primarily for social reasons, but there can be a masking of the individual self that can happen, which at times can be protection or protective. It's also, both terms are using spirituality for secondary gain. So the primary gain is not what we think to be the initial benefits of spirituality, typically. And again, that's a whole conversation in its own of what is the primary gain of spirituality. But, but again, bypassing my gain is not to hurt my feelings, basically, right? To remain safe in some kind of controlled environment and not acknowledge all the difficult things. And peacocking as well, there is some capital, right, that you're wanting to align with, and not, again, whatever we may define as kind of the primary gains of spirituality. So there's secondary gain to be gained in both of this, or both of these concepts. And some would say that because of that secondary gain, it distorts spiritual practice. And also it kind of bleeds into the ongoing, culture of spiritual practice and what it means, and even spaces like this, like the psychedelic space. So it kind of muddies the water a little bit, and again, kind of distorts intention maybe over time. So to quote one of my favorite scholars, RuPaul, we're all born naked and the rest is drag, right? And so I think that is a really accessible way of maybe introducing this idea of performativity, as I said, not to be mistaken with performance. So I'm borrowing this term of performativity from Judith Butler, and they're a professor and scholar who primarily works within gender studies. And I think this lens is also a really important one and a helpful one to look within the psychedelic space, because again, I see the same framework coming up in different ways that we'll kind of define here. In the context of gender, Butler says that gender is the repeated stylization of the body, a set of repeated acts within a highly rigid regulatory frame that congeal over time to produce the appearance of substance of a natural sort of being. So to break that down a little bit more, even in this concept of gender, right, this stylization of the body, this concept even of the body is a little bit more expansive than just like my physical body, right, like my head, shoulders, knees, and toes, right? The body expands out not only, to the things I wear, the body also expands out to our communities, right? And our conditionings, and what other factors and components actually shape us. According to Butler, performativity is, or I should say, gender is an act and it's a process. It's something that we do. It's not something that is innate or inherent to us, right? And so the same thing, is true with spiritual peacocking, right? I think we can use this same lens to say, or maybe to back up a little bit, I think a lot of times when we may identify a spiritual peacock in our environment, we may assign fault of sorts to the individual and say like, oh, that person is actively doing that, right? Or actively adopting all these things in their soul context. What I'm saying is, if we take this idea of performativity as Judith Butler introduced it in the context of gender, actually we all are a part of this peacock's way of expression, right? We contribute to the construct and the environment that allows them to flourish and allows them to engage in these practices and behaviors and ways that we then criticize, right? And so this is just kind of my first point of like, hey, what is my role, right? Like I'm pointing you out, and maybe I'm chastising or criticizing or whatever, but what is my role in validating, right, this persona that I may say is also harmful, right? So as I mentioned, I think I kind of mentioned before, there is a difference that Butler identifies between performativity and performance. So performance, according to Butler, is it implies that you're an actor and that you're choosing to play a role, right? So when I'm an actor on stage, I adopt the role of, whatever character, and I know that it's separate from me. With performativity, again, the social norms, the discourses help to create and sustain this identity. I might not have that separation to know that this is a role, right? So it's a little bit kind of unconscious, right? So not all peacocks may be intentionally peacocking, right? So it's a little bit um, yeah, and also, you know, the systems around us kind of guide us into these roles, again, that we may or may not be fully aware of, right? So it's not so much responsibility or fault placed on the individual. We all collectively are part of this. As part of the collective, there is also an emphasis on language. What language we use also creates this construct for which a peacock is formed and thrives. Butler talks about terms like girl or boy being part of language that is specifically gendered. And I would argue within the psychedelic space, terms like, you know, indigenous, terms like shaman, ritual, ceremony are also part of, and many other, you know, many other terms that are used are also part of the language that continues to create this construct, right? Even in you know, some spaces, I've heard, like even with the term indigenous, I've heard of wanting to move away from that term, right? And conversations about what are new terms that we can use, right? But that really is a common term within this space a lot of time, right? Indigenous practices, indigenous cosmologies, right? We use that term a lot in the psychedelic space. But again, it creates a very narrow framework for which, you know, these other byproducts, right, like a peacock can appear and are constructed. So just being aware of our language and as a component that we all use, and also language that we kind of adopt as fact, right? That, oh, indigenous is a fact, right? Girl or boy is a fact, right? Not so, according to this lens of performativity. And then lastly, there's this illusion of original or natural that also really ties in with this idea of language. So with terms like indigenous, right? There is this inherent idea of being the first, right? Getting down to the root of the practice. You know, what is argued through performativity is that there is no original, right? There is no core identity. That all of these are constructs that are constructed over time. And they are repeated behaviors that underlie this construction of original or natural or authentic, right? Which is also a term that kind of comes up a lot in the psychedelic space, especially around experiences and practices, right? How authentic was it, right? Was it in a certain place? Was it with a certain person? Were certain things said? Were certain things worn? Were certain things smelled, eaten, whatever, right? Yeah. So this performativity and this performance is used for spiritual capital, right? The gain, we talked about the secondary gain. The secondary gain is essentially spiritual capital, which leads a little bit into essentially how we designate authority. But to talk about spiritual capital a little bit, I should say about spiritual capital, it's kind of had a transformation over time in the way that we think about this concept. Originally, it was called specifically religious capital, and then over time, it's kind of transformed kind of more broadly into this idea of spiritual capital. So even in some of these three transformations, it's really kind of plots of, or little pins in time, or plots in time of how we think about this term. But again, I think also helpful in the way that we continue to frame this idea of spiritual peacocking. According to Iana Kone, spiritual capital is defined as the skills and experiences specific to one's religion, including religious knowledge, familiarity with church, ritual, and doctrine, and friendships with fellow worshipers, which produce religious resources that people define as valuable and explain religious behavior. So again, there's kind of this emphasis on skills, experiences that are specific, central, authentic to a particular practice, right? Again, a religion or a spiritual concept, which also is tied to familiarity within the organization or within the community, ritual and doctrine, which we'll talk about in just a little bit when we talk about Stark and Fink. But also friendships, right? Like also this social component, right? That also reinforces, skills and experiences and practices and whatnot. And also that we assign value to, right? So these are just life experiences essentially, right? What do you do with your life? How do you walk through this world that we then assign value to? That also can be seen in the psychedelic space, right? It's solely, I think there are different levels for which we assign value. And certainly the anecdotal and experiential level, we assign value, right? So without any, what we would say academic knowledge or hard science or, however you want to express that, just your own experience over your lifetime, maybe with psychedelic substances or substances of any kind, however you want to define it, can be defined many different ways, but that is valuable, right? And how much value we assign and where we put people in the hierarchy, I think is tied back to this idea that is expressed in Iannacone's definition of spiritual or religious capital. Moving forward, Stark and Fink defined spiritual capital as the degree of an attachment to a particular religious culture, including its doctrines, rituals, language, and traditions. So this is specifically kind of pulling out that the component that was previously mentioned within Iannacone's definition, but highlighting these specific attributes. What this can look like are folks who maybe are very well versed in maybe psychedelic history, right? Maybe they've read all of the works that we say are kind of foundational or fundamental or from the founding fathers of the space, right? They can be very well versed in it. They can be very well versed in maybe their knowledge or maybe even experience with practices from different sites around the world, or even history, or even language, right? The language that they use is also a way that they're signaling, and also traditions, right? So we said that this idea of origins or what's natural, and all of these concepts that we've kind of been building on can be seen in these types of expressions, and how we also assign authority there. Maybe even some might say, getting a master's in psychedelics, right, is just becoming more authority of doctrine, right, in the psychedelic space for somebody to assign authority to me and maybe to peacock a little. I don't know, right? I think the best kind of, or the broadest maybe, way to define this concept of spiritual capital is through Liu's definition, which also I think inherently does encompass aspects of other authors' definitions, but I think this is the broadest, maybe even the most understandable, and also gives wiggle room, because we said that this is these concepts are things that are built over time. But Liu said that spiritual capital is the power, influence, and disposition created by a person or organization's spiritual belief, knowledge, and practice. What I also really appreciate about this definition is also that it specifically mentions not just the person, but an organization, which I think is also very inherent to the psychedelic space, right? There's a lot of organizations that are involved, and which organizations do we assign value to? Do we assign authority to? Do we, say is the gold standard? I think also tie back to this definition of spiritual peacocking, these components of performativity, of performance, illusion of original and natural, right? All of these components, I think also ties back to that, and also where we put our money, right? So we'll talk a little bit about capital there as well. So yeah, so I think this is the broadest definition that helps us encompass all the things that are going on in this space as of now. So certainly, even when we talk about capital, there are different types of capital. And so even when we talk about the effects or how we assign, this value and this capital within the psychedelic space or spiritual space, I think it's also helpful to identify these types of capital because it's yes, we said that it's socially based, but also from social capital, you gain other types of wealth as well, and you gain access to other channels and forms of power and authority. So some of the types or forms of capital include wealth. So again, where do we put our money? Who has the most money? Just recent news, right? The acquisition of Psychedelically by Eli Lilly. Some would say that is ties back to some of the concepts that we're talking about where do bigger companies with more money put their wealth in the psychedelic space. That's a conversation to be had, right? Because certainly there's a lot of criticism as well about Psychedelically and their kind of practices and their position in the space, right? Power, right? Like ultimately what we're talking about here is power. Who has power in what communities and how is that exercised and how is that signaled? So we are talking about power. Essentially, we're talking about capacity, right? Also, what is your ability, right? With wealth, with power, with value, with more social power or social support and validation comes capacity. Folks have a larger reach. There is kind of more of a container to hold more of these concepts and for it to flourish in more places than one, certainly. Also, aspects of empowerment are also present here. But lastly, I think with all of these forms of capital, there is the assumption that capital is a seed that grows and generates more of itself. Certainly, we know that capital, ebbs and flows, right? You can certainly lose it, but inherent to our ideals of wealth, of power, of capacity, of empowerment, of social value, of peacocks is that it grows over time, right? So your power as a peacock, your value, your influence is assumed to grow over time. And again, makes us think, well, if that's what our assumption is, then we really need to take a look at who we are assigning this authority and power and money and capital and capacity to, right? So just going to move this a little bit. Okay. So I'm just going to, so with that, there's informal authority that we're essentially assigning through these means of capital. As we mentioned, right, like these are ways that we're identifying authority in very informal social ways, right? They're not specifically designated. There's no specific path to say, okay, you do this, 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 and this, or I guess I should say a standardized path, right? That you do these specific steps and then you're assigned authority. They're very informal ways and they're very different in different circles within the space. Which is interesting because, again, specifically in the psychedelic space, there's a lot of folks who have been assigned authority with different credentials, and it gets very messy about who to trust and what is safe and how is it being defined, right? So I did just want to call out some examples of informal authority because they also are rampant within this space. Again, these are just some. There are certainly more. And they're in no particular order, but myth is certainly an informal way of assigning authority that certainly is prevalent within this space. This can be story, this can be history, this can also be misinformation. So the stories that we tell ourselves about this history or the stories that we tell ourselves about the things we say we know, maybe false, right? But it gets into the lore, and then it is used as a status symbol, right? Like, how much do you know about history? How much do you know about psilocybin? How much do you know about mushrooms? How much do you know about on and on and on and on, right? There are various things that we can talk about these origin stories and myths about. Just jumping up to, relationship building. Again, social context, like, well, what are the relationships? What are the backdoor handshakes and relationships that we have, right? Sometimes authority is just based on who you know and not what you know. And if you are, well, some people may just be right place, right time, and some people may distinctly want to put themselves in specific places at specific times to then be assigned authority. So again, just kind of highlighting it to say, hey, maybe we should take a look at this and just be a little bit aware. Charismatic authority, again, like who, what's your personal presence? How charming are you? Can be a factor of how we assign authority. We have experts in the field, right? What are your credentials, right? Do you, I have, a master's in psychedelics, or I have a, PhD in neuroscience, or I have this, or I have that, right? That also becomes a way to assign authority. Also does not, it should be said that all of these things, intent, right, is not assessed in these designations of authority. Again, safety, what that may mean, the different versions of that are not assessed in these assignments of authority. And directly goes back to individuals with spiritual peacocking as well, right? That can be really difficult to navigate in the space. Persuasion, who has the best argument, right? Like the art of influencing with words, and words alone, right, is a way of designating authority. And then this one, agents of change, right, which we also see within the field, which are the folks who persist through resistance, right? It's kind of like the loudest person in the stadium, right? Whether you're right or wrong, just you being loud and persisting against the current, you're assigned some level of authority and validity, right? So again, all these things are just kind of swimming in the pond of the psychedelic culture and space and field right now. And even in the ways that we try to legitimize the field, right? A lot of these components also can be seen in maybe the ways that we, or the medicalization, maybe I should say, of a lot of psychedelic substances, right? The way that maybe clinical trials are administered or framed, right? They go by certain protocols, right? Maybe a lot of them are aligned with the MAPS protocols, right? And why, right? Maybe because of these same components, right? That we're talking about here. And again, that's also how not only individuals can maybe align with this idea of spiritual peacocking, but organizations can as well. And organizations that we, without review, assign as being at the forefront of this this field and this movement and this moment in time. And so just kind of jumping to what's next, right? So we've kind of created this arc of defining a peacock, of noticing what it is, what it isn't, highlighting ideas of performativity, performativity to gain capital, and to align with means of authority. What does that mean for the space, right? I don't know. I'm not going to claim to individually know, but I think that's also part of the point, right? I don't think there's any one person that we want to designate to say what is next. I think it is a call for all of us to be involved in it, right? But also to have a critical eye and to humbly look ourselves in the mirror about how we individually and collectively are shaping the space, and shaping a space that we also so heavily criticize, right? So next time you see an article about, something that's happening within the space that maybe you don't agree with, maybe ask yourself, what is my role, in this area or this topic? So I invite folks to maybe in the conversation that we have next, maybe give some ideas or thoughts or anything that's kind of top of mind for you in creating these space or this space. Yeah, and maybe seeing how we can have more framework to really make it safe, right? Because as we've seen, it's kind of loose. And what does that mean from our many perspectives? So yeah, so that's kind of a little introduction to spiritual peacocking, and I hope folks use it in the lexicon. I hope I hope to hear it a little bit more in the space. But again, I hope it just helps us all just take a look at ourselves and each other and have a little bit of an open conversation around it. So yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'll go ahead and stop sharing here.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sedina. I'm sure a lot of us have questions to build the conversation on. So I want to just pass the opportunity for questions to the floor. I can start if there's no one else that has something pressing. Um, I have a few things that I want to like return to, maybe based on what other people bring up. But one thing early on that I was wondering is it seems like the interactions between like basically it seems like since there's this phenomenon of spiritual peacocking that is like undeniably happening all around us, like that tendency of people to peacock gets used to um sell things to them or to other people and almost creating some kind of competition around what are things that you can buy using actual financial capital to increase your spiritual capital through this act of peacocking. So I was just wondering if you had any, I guess it's not a specific question, but just like thoughts on that. Um, yeah.
Absolutely. The marketing of the peacock, right? And then that there then are kind of tangible items that maybe folks would need to um, consume, to gain authority. But I think that also goes along with who we're assigning as authority, right? All these informal assignments, and then what they get to dictate, right? So we put all this power into one specific person, and then they say you have to buy X, Y, Z to then be in the circle, right? So and then it creates a lot of power imbalance, and especially when for lack of a better term, when you talk about like indigenous communities, right? Like that's a lot of another thing I'm looking at too is about reciprocity, right? Is reciprocity really equitable? Because it's a lot of organizations who have a lot of power, a lot of financial capital, who extract, right, practices, substances, plants, etc., from communities who have less money, and then they essentially sell it back to them, and they say, "Hey, we'll give you a little, a little kick, kick of the funds." But they're dictating who gets to play and what the price to play is, right? So it becomes really murky, and really yeah, really murky, really inequitable, really abusive, very quickly.
Yeah, that totally makes sense to me, unfortunately. And well, actually, Karen, yeah, you should jump in.
Well, I just wanted to build on your awesome question, Nathan. Like one of the areas that I'm kind of concerned about in the field is who becomes a trainer of people who then have authority to engage in commercialized practices with psychedelics in the West. And I wonder if it's partly like the age of maturity of the field in the West, why it is that, I guess, the people who got into it at a particular time by default get put into these positions. But, I've seen examples of where, yeah, peacocking is sort of like uncritically taken as, oh, this person's safe to learn from. And I just find that to be like an kind of super problematic risk. And so, like, in terms of the term peacocking, I kind of think like, what's at stake? Like, what is the purpose of putting forth a new term? And kind of for me, one example, like, what's the risk of not doing that? It just kind of helps us having conversations in lots of different areas. And this one thing on my mind is in this moment on kind of safety.
Yeah, and even safety is a fluid term, you know. Um, Maybe if I can answer your question with a story, right? Like the way that I or this idea initially came to me was through meditation. So I was in kind of a meditation group, right? And there was an opportunity for kind of questions and reflection um, with the teacher in this group setting, right? And to me, my experience of that was that it was other folks who were almost one-upping one another, you know? So this person's like, oh, I was seeing fractals and like going to other dimensions and the clouds parted and, whatever, right? And then someone else would say, yeah, and I saw, I went all the way to Mars. And, like it was, almost like in an academic class, right? Where students will kind of one up each other to get in favor with the professor. And so I was like, oh, wow, like even in spiritual practice, what we might identify as spiritual practice, people are trying, like, we're still human. We're still trying to be very competitive about it. Who's the best meditator? Who's shooting to the stars faster? But I think how this applies to your question around safety is that it may not be safe for me to shoot to the stars right now, right? But this drive for competition drives everybody to move bigger, stronger, faster, and also drives the field to move bigger, stronger, faster. And is that safe, right, for individually and collectively? I don't know, right? Again, I think it maybe needs a more in-depth look, about what that really means and looks like. Um, yeah, and maybe terms like this, and maybe even going further to define components, and I don't want to say like you know identifying spiritual peacocks necessarily, but maybe something along those lines, just for us to keep top of mind these concepts, so that we can continue to define it and also define it for ourselves. Because I think I do enjoy the autonomy of the space, that people are able to choose for themselves. But I think also it's very hard for folks to navigate what does safety look like for me, and how do I safely choose within a space with so much choice. So yeah, so individually and collectively, I think, yeah, hopefully this term creates a conversation around safety. Yeah. Um, and yeah.
I have a slightly different question if we want to take a bit of a turn.
Yeah.
Uh, it's this question that I was thinking about. Sedina, why do you think seeing spiritual peacocking makes us or makes people uncomfortable? In the sense of, it seems like, if you're in like a psychedelic space, there's this like uncomfortable in two ways. Wanting to push it away and not have it be there, and other people uncomfortable in the sense of, oh, I'm, maybe there's something missing. It's, I need to move towards that. So people then kind of gravitate towards that. So yeah, basically my question is like, why do you think that seeing this spiritual peacocking makes us uncomfortable, uncomfortable enough to have this conversation today, and maybe that can kind of drive home at maybe more where we want to go with this conversation in the future of the field?
I think the short answer is because, we all have a little peacock inside of us. Because I think confronting the question means we have to challenge why we're in the space. So going back to my example of like a meditation class or a group, right? I have to challenge, well, why am I here? what am I really seeking in this? And also, how do I know when I've achieved it? If it is achievable, right? So I think it's hard because we have the first definition or the first critique has to be of ourselves. Do I, what is the language that I use when I talk about, the things within this space, or, am I appropriating customs or practices or authority? I think you can appropriate authority in a lot of ways too. Within this space, right? And also, am I being opportunistic? Because the space is so loose, am I using this space to fill a void where I don't have the same power and privilege in other places in my life, right? Because I think that happens as well, because there are a lot of figures who just kind of popped up in here. And again, going back to the idea of safety, that can be tricky. That can be tricky um, to navigate. So yeah, I think it's hard because we have to look at ourselves first, right? We can't just keep assigning responsibility and blame to other people. That's easy, right? We can, you're such a, like, with your hats and you're this and you're that, but it's like, maybe I have a hat and maybe I'm burning some incense too. And, yeah, so I think that's the hardest part.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I guess I'm just wondering, bouncing off of Reed's kind of train of thought there, like maybe part of the discomfort comes from this like cognitive dissonance of like the whole point of the peacocking ostensibly is to like establish some kind of authority or authenticity. But if you're able to recognize that in someone else, it undermines their like authenticity or authority. I think it if you're recognizing that you're peacocking, that someone else is peacocking, it's like yeah, it undermines that authenticity, I would think, to a lot of people. So I don't know. Is there
Yeah, I
anything?
think also because it's so fickle. I think it's like it's a bit
Hmm.
of a house of cards, because as soon as you start critiquing it or thinking about, okay, why do I assign authority, or what is this, or whatever, things fall apart. And
Hmm.
things fall apart pretty quickly. I think I was at a talk recently, and I think someone asked, why like why are the Shipibos kind of the gold standard for ayahuasca practices, right? Within, kind of the Western gaze or Western interest. I don't know. I don't know. And I think it's the answer is probably really, really flimsy, and might be, oh, because you heard somebody else, you know, practice in that tradition or went to Peru and whatever, right? And again, I'm not like I'm not saying that like it's necessarily bad, but I'm just saying, again, like, let's have a critical lens about it. Um, so yeah, it's all quite flimsy, and I think because of that flimsiness, it can also be quite scary, right? That like, oh, I'm just taking someone's word of mouth, and I don't really know how they define safety, and I don't really know. Um, really any concrete details, and I don't really know, right? There's so many things we don't know that we're so quick to assign authority and expertise and um, um, power, in shaping a whole field, right? I think also another critique I sometimes have, again, I think all forms of knowledge are valuable, but I think it's also tricky in this space, when your, personal anecdotes are the base of your authority and your knowledge and your presence in the space. Again, it's very valid, but I think it's also tricky. And so how do we navigate that? How do we validate that, but also acknowledge? And also not saying that experts have all the knowledge, right? How do we acknowledge that while also being critical about boundaries, right? Of yeses and nos, and how you individually want to move through this space, because it is so new.
Yeah, that totally makes sense too. Like the stability thing, especially because like you said at the end, like it is so new, and because of prohibition, there's been like a lot of limitations on like kind of forming community around this thing until relatively recently. So maybe it's even more of a touchy thing because of that.
Hmm. Yeah,
Um
yeah.
yeah.
And who's at the table, you know? Um,
Mhm.
I think, right, because of the power dynamics of assigning authority, again, we're all human, so we like to assign authority to people who are like ourselves, and that doesn't create a robust conversation for different aspects in the field, you know.
Mhm.
Or we like people who continue to validate, right? That positive feedback loop. We like people who continue to validate our presence and our goodness and our, you know,
Mhm.
authority or knowledge or whatever. And so yeah, so we just kind of get yes people in the space where there might be a lot of harm and there might be a lot of gaps that we're not. Doesn't mean we have to address them, but at least acknowledging. Um,
Mhm.
Can I ask
Absolutely.
another question? Sedina, I wonder how you would frame also like the cross-cultural aspect of some of these conversations. Like, because we're talking, for example, if you bring in ayahuasca tourism, and so like people bringing back what they, experienced and then using that to build authority in groups that really have no contact or knowledge of, kind of where they went or who they encountered. Like, yeah, I wonder if you have any thoughts on that topic.
yeah. Again, even I think it's tricky. Again, because it's a bit of a um, tightrope. Um, so I think I lost my train of thought. So you're saying, say that again. I'm so sorry, Karen.
Oh, I'm just thinking about the cross-cultural aspects. So, folks who've traveled to another country and, had an encounter where they learned from people from different positions, different backgrounds, different cultures, and then they kind of, maybe it's an appropriation comment,
Mm,
but thinking about like, it's one thing to engage in like certain performance practices like wearing certain things. But like sometimes I think in some of these practices abroad, like it can get incentivized. Like people are taught almost appropriative things. Like I've heard a story about a friend who traveled and she said, we were all taught to yell aho after the ceremony, but nobody taught us what that word was, what it meant, where it originated. Like, why are we even doing this? But then that word gets brought back and then brought to other social spaces. And then other people are like kind of like the feeling or what they learned or whatever about it. And then it kind of spreads in other contexts that are even more kind of removed,
mhm.
and nobody knows why they're doing it or what it means.
The first thing that comes up for me is around language because I've noticed how it gets really tricky with language, right? Like folks will say things that I've commonly heard or like you know, like I'm trained in a certain lineage, right? Um, and then folks may go on to talk about the length of time that they spent with certain communities in that lineage or things like that. And I think for me, again, having this critical lens, I'm like, well, what does that mean, right? Because at first glance, you might assign authority, say, oh, this person is, right? We assign what we know. We say, oh, this person is a blank, right? Because they have X training with this community and they're signaling all these things that they are, a full-fledged, shaman, if that's what you want to call them. But what do you actually mean by, trained in a certain lineage, right? Does that mean you just hung out with folks in a certain community? Does that mean you were there for a week? Like, what exactly does that mean? I think we should be a little bit more critical, right? And ask those questions because again, just because you weren't trained by XYZ doesn't mean you're not um, someone that I might want to hear from or someone who has a valid place in the space. But I want to know what I want to be able to interpret what that means for myself. And I think that's part of the persona, right? And the kind of hiding behind these different components of peacocking, right? Whether it be language or like, and again, language certainly ties into, this whole idea of original and natural, because a lot of the key words that may be dropped in those moments are kind of key words that we kind of listen for to say like, oh, you're the one, you're legit, you're, and also that legit means safe, right? Because it certainly doesn't. So I guess that's what I kind of turn to. I think there's certainly more aspects to be discussed around it, but I think language comes up for me because I think we can miss a lot of things, right? Like there are just things that just kind of pass by our ears and we take it, for face value. But if we kind of do a double take and be like, well, what do you say more? What was your experience? Like, where were you? What did you do? When was this? What? It might produce different answers. Yeah.
Comment. And it feels to me that how profound this is and how wideswept it is culturally everywhere. I think that one of the key pillars to this is to be able to sit with our discomfort because this is very difficult. I don't know what's right and wrong. I don't want to make a mistake. And all these incredible existential anxiety and difficult questions about who I am and who I think I am and how sure I am, and all the pillars that I believe in now, you've kind of melted them, and I think it's good, right? So it's just a comment, and I think maybe that's one of the places where we have to kind of begin to sit there. Um, yeah, no, this is extraordinary. It's so difficult though.
A lot of discomfort. Yeah. And very challenging because it feels like we have to like burst somebody's bubble, which I also don't think we have to do, which I think, might be an extension of, defining this term is like, how do we go about conversations, and hard conversations within the space? Because I do think it, we can sometimes be tiptoeing around very difficult things that maybe if there were a more reasonable way of addressing them, that maybe they might actually not be as difficult as we're assuming them to be, and maybe it might actually lead to a lot more equity within the space and collaboration between many folks in different areas.
Yeah, that makes sense. As a psychotherapist, and working mostly with the Latinx community, there are times where we're 30 minutes in and I basically say, I have no idea what's going on and I have no idea what to do.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
kind of that uncertainty is difficult. At the same time, it feels better. So speaking to, it doesn't have to hurt so much, maybe.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah. And also I think the space doesn't have to be any one thing,
yes.
I think that's where we kind of get into trouble, and where peacocks start to show up because we think whatever the experience is, right? So X experience has to be one thing, right? For me to be a great meditator, I have to see fractals. For me to be, a psychonaut, I have to, go far away, right? I have to get on a plane, go to another country where I don't speak the language and like, hike into the depths of the earth to, do this practice well, and so, yeah, so sure, you can do that. And maybe there are other other ways of getting to where you're wanting to go. Maybe that's also a question. Where do you want to go? Where are you trying to get? What are you trying to deal with or manage or experience, right? Maybe that's also a question to ask ourselves.
I just feel all the pickups coming up when I'm asking that question because you run into that same thing. So, but it's important for sure.
Yeah, yeah.
Do you think this concept, say people will start discussing this more openly, could cause some like conflict within these kind of communities? Because it seems like it could potentially ruffle some feathers. Sorry for the
I love the pun. Yeah, I mean, I think folks have already been doing this. I mean, I think I don't know why it comes top of mind. I think I read a recent article just kind of discussing like Octavio Rettig, right? Who I don't know if folks are familiar with him, but he was kind of like big in the Bufo space. And he kind of part of his promotion of the use of Bufo was that he uh, said it was part of this kind of long lineage and tradition within Mexico of using bufo, which is right kind of toad secretions that are psychoactive. And actually, it was found no, there is not a lineage or a history of this, right? And so, but a lot of he was, front page on various sites or articles or right invited as speaker or whatever, right? He was in authority and on bufo and the original practices of bufo, all false. So yeah, so I guess it makes me think of folks like that and how it shows up and how we have been critical, but also how maybe our again lack of specificity in this term allow folks to pop up reborn, right? Because there are abuses, folks recognize the abuses, but then they're able to pop up after some time, our minds wiped clean, and then they participate again in the same cycles and components to then gain power and continue on in ways that, again, you mentioned may be unsafe or I just might not want to participate in or assign authority to.
Thank you.
Oh, Sedina, the more and more we talk about this, the more and more I really do think that this is a really important, persistent question because about the peacocking and like identity and all this stuff. Because I was thinking, these, whatever you would like to call them, substances, plants, spirits, etc., that people interact with. A lot of times, these are radically identity deconstructing experiences. And then they have this kind of like reemergence, like, oh, come back, there's this reemergence experience. And there's this like need for like identity kind of reconstruction after, like this like kind of persistent desire for identity reconstruction. And a lot of those experiences, at least, if you go on like Arrowhead and all that stuff, they talk about, they don't want the old, quote unquote, let's call it the old personality because they identified, issues with it. And now they're, intimately searching for some kind of new identity. And then I think that so I guess this is kind of a roundabout way of saying there seems to be perhaps two kind of groups of peacocks, let's say, emerging, where ones that, you do see some people who seem to, you question like the faith of their actions, good faith, bad faith, power, all that stuff. And there's some other people who seem just genuinely, they went into the abyss and now they're looking for like a self-referential anchor point. So they start constructing all stuff. So anyways, I don't know, what do you think about that? Because like different kinds of peacocking that goes around, or perhaps if anyone else has any thoughts about that.
Yeah, I think that also that kind of maybe like moves into some of my other interests too. Right. So in the introduction, just kind of talking about other African cosmologies or other gold standards of these types of experiences. And so I think one that certainly is not in the psychedelic record or not or often is not recognized often in common spaces is Afrofuturism, which through that lens, we are not trying to break down the ego. We are not trying to, fragment ourselves. We're not trying to become anew. We're just trying to return to ourselves. And so that's another way of, conceptualizing this. So again, I think this idea of a peacock, there is, and especially within psychedelic culture, because I think what we see as dominant psychedelic culture is one thing, right? It is that, oh, I want to become anew. I want to fragment the self. I want ego dissolution. That is the experience that I want. And I think no, right? I mean, and even right, if we really want to talk about some of these original practices, within some original practices, there is not this biomedical model of being ill, right? For which we seek out these experiences, or even it is not those who are ill who receive the substance. It might be a communal leader or a spiritual leader who is ingesting these things to diagnose you and to help you while you are still in this dimension. So even, right, the whole construct of like, what is this experience and like, what are we doing and what does it mean? I think again needs some deconstruction because it feels like it's one thing. And because it's one thing, it allows these peacocks and even these different breeds of peacock to flourish in different spaces, so yeah, right. I think all of it needs to be looked at, deconstructed, I don't know, right? But there's a lot of analysis to be had there.
Well, thank you. No, I'm looking hopefully forward to part two of this talk after that after that teaser. But thank you, super interesting.
Yes, absolutely.
Other questions from the group? Well, suppose if they're we'll do a going 3, 2, 1. But yeah, if there aren't any other burning questions for now, maybe we will pick this up with part 2 at some point, hopefully. Um, thank you again, Sedina, and thanks everyone for staying and chatting. This is really fun. I always love getting to just throw some of the ideas around um, at the end of these. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I super appreciate it. And yeah, I appreciate folks hopping on and yeah, just taking interest enough to just even click join.
Definitely. And this will be recorded and up on YouTube later, so keep that in mind if you want to share any of this. It would be much appreciated. But I suppose for now we will adjourn. Thank you again, Sedina. Awesome stuff. Looking forward to seeing where it goes. And yeah, hopefully have you on again at some point.
Yeah, I would love
So
to.
yeah, lovely seeing all of you.
Yeah.
And we will reconvene later.